So as we just heard, as the United States wants allies to step up on the Strait of Hormuz, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi met President Donald Trump just days after Trump lashed out at European and Asian allies for rejecting his call to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. For more on this, we're joined today by Dr. Mikyoung, senior researcher at Gyeongsang National University. Dr. Kim, thanks for making the time today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Dr. Kim, some say Prime Minister Takaichi had the bad luck of being one of the first allies to meet President Trump in person since the start of the war. What do you make of the summit yesterday?
Yes, the timing of her visit was actually very, very tough. She, I think, was under a lot of pressure. And as you have mentioned, NATO member countries, Germany, and Spain, for instance, said no outright to President Trump's request for support, while the UK remains lukewarm. France suggested negotiation. Frustrated, or I should say angered by the lack of support of the NATO member countries, President Trump has begun to pressure Asian countries that use the Strait of Hormuz to transport oil and natural gas. He specifically mentioned China, Japan, and South Korea. In justifying his demands for the Asian countries' support, President Trump cited some statistics during the summit meeting with Prime Minister Takaichi. For instance, 95% of China's, 90% of Japan's, and 35% of Korea's energy sources pass through the strait. And here, let me remind you of the fact that President Trump sometimes does not get the numbers right. For instance, when he talks about U.S. Troops stationing in South Korea, he says the number is between 40,000 and 45,000, and Korea does not bear the burden by paying the price to host them. You know, it's not true. I mean, you know, Korea picks up the half of the tab. So with that caveat in the mind, President Trump is saying that the countries who use the strait must do their burden sharing. And at this point, we have to ask the following questions. First, should China's reliance on the strait be the biggest? Why did he postpone his Beijing trip by about 6 weeks? And why did he still want to hold summit meeting with Japan? You know, those questions come to our mind naturally. Both summit meetings were pre-planned and agreed upon beforehand. So I believe President Trump thinks that Japan will be very, very agreeable with his demands, and Tokyo government will politely cooperate with Washington. So by doing that, interestingly, President Trump inadvertently revealed that China and Japan have different priorities in his power hierarchy. In other words, Mr. Trump has convinced, I think, Mr. Xi Jinping that he is wary of dealing with Beijing vis-a-vis Tokyo.
I see. And like you just mentioned, South Korea was one of the countries that President Trump mentioned should send support to the Strait of Hormuz. So how might Japan's stance on the strait affect, South Korea's position on providing support to safeguard the waterway?
Let me think. That is, during the press conference with Japanese media after closed-door summit meeting, Prime Minister Takaichi reported that she expressed caution in dispatching self-defense force to the Middle East to President Trump. She mentioned about the pacifist constitution as the red line that should not be crossed. Prime Minister Takaichi also mentioned her own request to President Trump that Japan wants to see earliest possible de-escalation of conflict in the Middle East. Yet, we know that there are precedents where Japan sent troops to support the US. For instance, former Prime Minister Koizumi, for example, enacted a special law in 2001 to assist George W. Bush's war on terror. And another precedent regards former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who also sent troops to the Strait of Hormuz in 2019 for the theoretical mission of investigation and research. So we should be mindful of the fact that Japan sent troops after war was over in both cases. Against this backdrop, we get to see a link between the two stances taken by Ms. Takaichi. That is, if the conflict is de-escalated and finally settled, she could cite those precedents in order to justify the deployment of self-defense force. Considering the very low approval rating of Iran war in domestic Japan at about 9%, she would need to be very cautious not to provoke her supporters by hastily accommodating President Trump's demands in this very unpopular war. Okay, then, regarding your question about what does that mean for South Korea, what should we do? We need to remind Washington that the context of South Korea and Japan differ widely. That is, if South Korea dispatches our troops to the Middle East, South Korea's security will be compromised greatly. That is particularly so with North Korea's latest rocket launch provocations and also U.S. redeployment of Patriot missiles and THAADs out of South Korea's territory bound for the Middle East. We can argue that our own national defense should be our top priority, and we cannot afford to take a risk of mobilizing our own troops to the Middle East. And I believe that would make a lot of common sense to whoever listens to that kind of argument.
I see. It's a complicated issue. And during the summit, President Trump also brought up Pearl Harbor when asked about why the United States didn't give allies like Japan a heads up before striking Iran. What do you think he meant by that?
You know, I personally was very surprised to hear his remark about Pearl Harbor. But when we think about him, Mr. Trump is an alpha male with business background. Now he is the leader of the most powerful country in the world. His sense of humor can be acerbic, quick, and potentially offensive. Yet his status saves him from possible retaliations for making those offensive comments, even to the leaders of other sovereign countries. Here, let me gently remind you of his unnecessarily candid remarks about French President Mr. Macron's sunglasses at the Davos Forum, and his curt belittlement of British Prime Minister Starmer by comparing him with Winston Churchill. Even though people cannot retaliate given the power imbalance between the offender and the offended, you know, the people who felt belittled cannot forget the horrible feeling, you know? So I think more and more leaders of the world are turning their backs against the US and President Trump. And I think his mentioning of Japan's surprise attack of Pearl Harbor was one of those moments when he did not think through before spitting the words out. And I also remember Ms. Takaichi's look on her facial expression, that she was very surprised, and I think she even made some moaning sound, you know. And let me also share this information that the Japanese people were not happy with President Trump's Pearl Harbor comments. And when the summit meeting was live broadcast, real time in Japan, the most popular comment left in the site was this word, saite. Saite means the worst in Japanese. So I think the Japanese citizens were equally surprised by President Trump's possibly offensive remark about Japan's surprise attack against the US in 1941.
Right. That comment was a surprise for many. All right, Dr. Kim, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for taking the time. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.